Okay, I think 5 minutes may have passed, and I see some of the panelists coming back. I see Bill there, and Karin, and Lance is perhaps not, and Frida, there is Frida. See if Lance is coming back there. There's Lance coming back. Okay, let's continue. And Frida, your sound was going in and out a bit, but perhaps when you answer, you can turn off your camera and see if that works better then. And then you can just say something if you want to break in, because we want to have you, of course. The first question that I had here was how you would describe the 2020 campaign. It's almost over. Tomorrow it's election day. How would we describe it? What sticks out? How will we remember the 2020 campaign? Karin, please unmute yourself and start saying something.
No, just we've been very negative, right? So I was going to say something positive, which is the voter participation. It's quite amazing, isn't it? That there's so many who really want to participate this time. That's a positive. And if I can say something negative, so it is obviously the Donald Trump's shamelessness, that you can be as a candidate, that you can say the things he's saying about his opponent. That is really sad. And is it possible to go back after this?
Is it possible?
Kind of normal, as we've talked about. I mean, reason will that ever come back?
You think it will?
I hope so, but it's not looking good right now. And I mean, I should have said something too about you hear what you hear, what you want to hear, you see what you want to see. And then all of us should obviously read a little more Marsha Gessen and Anna Applebaum about the risks of autocratic slide, or whatever you say.
Okay. Anyone else wants to chime in to how we will remember the 2020 campaign? Lance, you unmuted yourself.
Well, I just wanted to point out one moment which occurred just a day ago, in which a Biden campaign bus in the state of Texas traveling from San Antonio to Austin was surrounded by a fleet of 100 or so pickup trucks and SUVs with Trump flags, and they tried to run the bus off the road. And I think this is just one, and then Trump tweeted, "I love Texas." After that. And I think that this indicates the complete breakdown of the norms that are so important for democracy to function. I mean, I mentioned earlier that the Republicans are attacking the legal underpinnings of democracy itself. But the norms of how to talk to each other, of not calling your opponents terrible names, of not running the opposition campaign bus off the road, these, I think, may be more important even than laws. So democracies depend on laws and norms, and both have been severely violated. And I don't think it's going to be easy without institutional reforms, without serious political reforms, to bring any kind of unity back to America.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Anyone else? Frida or Bill, do you have any comments on the campaign? What will you remember? Bill, what will you remember from the 2020 campaign?
I'll remember, I think, on June the 1st, the clearing of the streets between the White House and a church using tear gas against peaceful protesters. These weren't people who were tearing up the nation's capital, but tear gas was used and they were cleared out, and the President of the United States stood in front of the church in something that was the most inept photo opportunity in the history of the world. He held the Bible upside down in the way that someone who perhaps might open the Bible and read it, never would. And he stood there for a little while, and then he went back over to the White House. And I found myself wondering if I had ever seen a movie that confused me as much as that photo opportunity. And so for me, that's one of the most memorable instances. And then I'll just add, I agree with Lance's example that surrounding a car or a bus, a campaign bus on a freeway, and then the Trump pickups slowing down and then trying to steer the bus off, that's memorable. Just yesterday, I got an email from one of my colleagues at the University of Puget Sound saying, what are our responsibilities if indeed Trump does declare victory tomorrow night? If he gets ahead and says, well, clearly I've won, what are our responsibilities? And I got to admit, I have no idea. I have no idea how I would be able to or willing to respond to that, because we have no map for this. There are, as Lance said, the norms have been shot, and to whom would I even appeal? To whom would I take my grievance, etc.? So for me, this has been a most absurd, doesn't even cover it. It's been an utterly bizarre time. Sorry, that's the best I can do.
Would you say before we let Frida in, would you say that a term that is often used in American studies, as some of you who are in here are in the field, I see some of my students, the term is used, exceptionalism, that the United States is an exceptional country. Is this an exceptional campaign? I mean, is it qualitatively different? I mean, all campaigns are different, but they proceed along similar lines with similar norms, as Lance suggested. Is this something fundamentally different, something new? The way that is.
I think so, Doug. Remember, Trump said during the 2016 campaign that he could shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue in Manhattan in full view of the audience, immediate and televised, and not lose any votes in doing it. This is not what I had gotten used to. I've seen quite a few presidential campaigns, and this is not what I'd gotten used to. I'd gotten used to small, meaningless mistakes being blown up into ways to disqualify people from continuing to run for the presidency. Lance and I easily can come up with myriad examples of things where you go, intellectually, politically, it doesn't matter at all, but it was enough to doom a campaign. And yet with Donald Trump, it seems there's nothing he can do to lose the 40 to 45% that he calls his base. He just can't lose them. So, yeah, I'm without a map, without a chart, a political scientist who doesn't have any science to help him to make sense of politics.
Whoa. Karin?
Just minor points. I think, first of all, it was shorter, obviously, because of the pandemic, and there weren't no conventions in the conventional sense. And, well, I'll get back to it.
Frida, now we turn to Frida. Turn on your camera.
No, I won't turn on my camera because of the very bad Wi-Fi I have, I think,
Okay.
but you can hear me.
We can hear you now. We hear you loud and clear.
Yeah. I don't have very many things to add here. I think the others have pointed out all what makes this election and also very worrying. I don't know how to get back to normal after this. And also when you look at the internet and social media, there are so many conspiracy theories and things that is working behind the scenes, so to speak, that makes a huge difference also in this election and play in. But on the other hand, I see many things, but I'm in Sweden and I have not been in the US during the election cycle now this year, which makes it very difficult to say anything in particular insightful about the campaigns and so forth. But you have also seen that many problems about the US democracy has been raised and discussed. I don't know if it's in a new way or more in-depth way, but I think so, because we do talk about voter suppression, about voting rules from 2013 and the impact, and what is happening all around in different states now when we are going to count the votes and so forth. And you have also the Black Lives Matter movement that certainly have put the question about race and about the police violence and so forth on top of many things. So it's not just a pandemic, it's also other very important questions that at least are discussed.
Mm-hmm.
I just remember what I was going to say, and that is, has there been an election campaign where the party candidate has gotten so much opposition from his own sort of elite? I mean, the number of famous, well-regarded Republicans that have come forward and said they cannot vote for Donald Trump. Isn't that amazing?
Mm-hmm. There have been instances in American history, as you know, when parties have disappeared. Sometimes I ask myself, is this a Whig moment when the Whig party disappeared and was transformed? There are such turning points sometimes in American history. Historians talk about that when parties shed and something new comes out. I don't know if the Republican Party, Lance, you had some comments about the Republican Party. Is the Republican Party, I mean, obviously what Trump represents is very, very different from the two previous Republican presidents, the Presidents Bush. I don't think that they voted for him in 2016. And I don't know what for whom George W. is going to vote. Maybe not Biden, maybe for Joe Jorgensen. I don't know. But will there be another party coming out of this?
If this was a fair election, political scientists have a term for what you talked about, the disappearance of parties or the changing power of parties, called a realignment. And this should be a realigning election, given all the polls, all of the trends, the massive voter turnout. I mean, these are all characteristics of what I learned in grad school as a realigning election. But the difference is between the textbook version and the reality that we're watching, that Bill has described so well, is that this election is going to be won or lost in the courts, and based on voter suppression and really things that are illegal. And this is not all due to Trump. The Republican Party, as I suggested in my comments, has been on this path for some time to prevent it becoming an irrelevant party. But the problem is that it's now also a very volatile party, because the idea of the coup by law, the takeover by legal means of a minority government, permanent minority government, didn't factor Trump and a wild and crazy collection of passionate citizens who are heavily armed, didn't take that into account. So we'll have to see. I don't know. There's no, as Bill said, no textbook help coming on this one.
Mm-hmm. A realignment election. One thinks of realignment, one thinks of 1896 and 1860 and 1932.
Exactly, 1964. I mean, a lot of, but, and that's what this should be.
But that we will know 10 years from now. You know,
Well, we might know it by December or January.
oh, but December, January, yes.
Yeah, I think that there are two possible scenarios.
Let me follow up on this before we move over to a question about Sweden. You all paint I listen to you, and it's a rather dark assessment of where things stand in the United States on many fronts here: voter suppression, disinformation, increasing inequalities, and so forth. And I wonder, do you think there is a path forward? Will the United States be able to deal with these serious problems? You talked about serious need for institutional reform. I just got a new book by one of your colleagues, Bill and Lance, namely Bob Putnam's new book, The Upswing, where he discusses these changes. But it ends by suggesting that America can come back, what we can do about it. He talks about the progressive age in the beginning of the 20th century as a reaction to a period in the late 19th century when the United States was extremely polarized and large divisions. And then things got better, he can show with many graphs, greater equality and so forth. And then it turned down again in the 1970s. And he hopes for another upswing. Are you optimistic? Do you think the United States can fix these problems? That's a question for all of you.
Want me to start?
Yes.
I want to be optimistic, obviously, but there are reasons not to be that optimistic. And first of all, is obviously the political system itself. I mean, it doesn't really work, right? So whoever comes in may have opposition in Congress. But what I think that there are two things that are interesting about when it comes to the Republican Party, and also in a great more overall sense, and that is, where will the money go? Where will the capitalists decide? What will they support? And then obviously, if this pandemic goes on, young people don't feel any hope for the future, and they have other priorities than these 60, 70, 80-year-old Trump voters. So will there be, that is one an issue that I'm interested in. Where will there be some kind of resurgence for the left in America?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Anyone else want to give a comment on optimism or pessimism? I'm pressing you a little bit now. Maybe I shouldn't.
Well, how about realism?
Realism, yes, please.
I really often think that the optimism-pessimism discussion misses the point about you can, if your pessimism is grounded in empirical evidence and trends, then it's more realism than pessimism. And I think that we need a realistic analysis. The left is in disarray in this country. I mean, Trump and Fox News are calling it an angry mob, but it's less organized than that even. And so the question is, can the left really tackle democracy as our most fundamental cause and create a reform movement? If you dial the clock back 100 years, the US was full of corruption. The parties were in disarray. There were multiple parties at that point. And a reform movement, the progressive era, actually reformed institutions, more or less got rid of the political machines in this country, restored some of the franchise. The race problem was as alive and well as ever. But they restored the franchise for many citizens, and they also began to create a different media system. I mean, they created a civic audience for a different media. And the press system that was born in the 1920s is now dying today. So there's a big agenda. And the question I see is, can the left, and it would come from the left, and these few progressive Republicans that I think Karin talked about, who are fed up with where the current party is going, can they join together to organize a really sustainable political reform movement? And that I don't know, but I think that's what is needed.
Okay. Bill or Frida, do you want to chime in here? Bill?
I'll just second a couple of things that we've just heard. Number one, I think Karin is correct that trust has been broken. I mean, faith between people. Lance talked about the norms. So we can rephrase the question in terms of each of us has had interpersonal relationships. How do you restore trust? And then multiply it, or indeed it's an exponential leap up to how do you do that in a nation? But it is the case that we have some generations who are used to the personality cult around Donald Trump, and I'm not sure how they're going to respond to that. So I think issues of trust are a problem. And I don't know what's going to be done about the sheer mendacity, the habit of lying. Indeed, I'll turn a question back at you, Doug. You've asked about American exceptionalism. In Sweden, is it conceivable to you that someone could run for high office and have 20,000 lies documented by some newspaper, such that even if you divide by 10 or divide by 100, still the fellow is one of the greatest liars ever? Could that work in Sweden?
I'm looking at Erik Åsad here, my predecessor. I don't know what you say, Erik. You have to unmute if you want to join in this discussion, or maybe you don't want to do it. But could we see this in Sweden? We of course know that Sweden is very much influenced by the United States. Is this an area where you see American influences, Erik?
Yes. Wow, what a question. I've never even considered the question before, but I think lies are still taken pretty seriously over here. As if you follow Trump day by day, you get numb. I got numb, the day after the election when he said this thing about the crowd size. So it's been futile to follow him. But here, no, I don't think it would. We had an interesting example, Doug, as you remember, a former quite erratic leader of the Social Democratic Party for just 2 years or so, a while back, got caught by lying once or twice. And then he repeated it 3 times, 4 times, and then it became a pattern. And then the media, whenever he said something just slightly wrong or dubious, they hit on him. And eventually he couldn't take it, he resigned. So that may answer your question.
So Sweden is resisting that American influence, you can say. Frida, it's your turn to say something about this question.
Yes, very short. I have to say I'm pessimistic, but the main reason for that is due to the logic that on internet and social media, because people are consuming very narrow perspectives on what is happening and what is true and not true. And having all these things, the factors working now with frustration, fear, also inequality and racism, and all these sentiments, and both real and imagined, so to speak, and living their own life on the internet. That is something that creates an environment and make it very much more difficult than before. We didn't think that would be the case when we got this information on social media, but it seems like it's more difficult than before to actually meet and discuss things without just screaming out all the feelings at the same time. So I think that's the main reason why I'm very worried, because it definitely makes it more difficult to come together and solve problems. Add to that we do have some really, really serious problems that we need to address and work together globally with the climate change, and also now with the pandemic and the economical consequences of that. We actually, it's going to be very difficult. On the other hand, you have a young generation now that they, at least as it seems, they are turning out to vote in huge numbers, maybe even set a record high number this election. And it seems like they are very concerned about climate change and all racial questions and so forth. But again, the internet makes me pessimistic.
Okay, thank you, Frida. I'm pessimistic from the internet sometimes too, by the internet for other reasons. But thank you all very much for your very good comments here. We didn't get to the question about Sweden and American politics, but we will save that for a later day, why we are so focused on it, but we'll come back to that. Now we have about 15 minutes left, and we have a number of questions from the audience. But before we go to the questions, I'm going to ask you all for one question to which you can give an answer, which is just one name. And that is the question, who do you don't need to give a long explanation if you don't want to. It's enough to just give us a name. Karin, you go first.
Yeah, I'll make it easy. There won't be any victory tomorrow night.
But in 4 weeks, who do you think will have won then? No?
I'm not saying anything.
She's not saying anything. Okay, she's wise. Lance, do you have a prediction?
Well, I agree with Karin. How's that for a decisive?
Okay.
Yeah, I think we won't know anything for some time. And as I say, the Republicans, and this isn't just Trump, but Trump is encouraging it, are going to try to steal the election. And they're going to file legal cases in several swing states. Pennsylvania, as I said earlier, is very important this time. And as they work their way up, the Supreme Court is going to have to decide. I mean, this is a moment of truth, and Bill may want to comment on this as well, but it's a real moment of truth for the Supreme Court. There have been little signs here and there that the Roberts Court has tried to maintain some kind of nonpartisan guise, which is, of course, not true, but the legitimacy of the court is still important. And if the court throws this election for Trump after a landslide vote against him, this is not going to be the 3 million votes that Hillary got. This could be a 5 to 10 million vote margin for Biden. And if the court overturns the election, I think we're going to end up in a very chaotic next decade here.
Okay, Frida, what is your answer to this question?
Well, I can't add anything else and say anything more than I don't have any answer. I don't think perhaps we will even know for a couple of weeks or even longer. But I am, as Lance, very concerned about the attempts in Republican-led states to obstruct fair elections, and I think that might play a bigger role than many want to admit. Then, as Lance said, it's going to be chaotic in many different ways.
Okay, no name from Frida either. Last chance, Bill from Tacoma. Do we get a name from you?
Sure. Biden will win. Okay. He'll win the popular vote. I think there's a non-trivial chance that he'll get enough electoral votes that they won't even be able, Trump will still want to go to the courts, but all that has to happen is enough people refuse to go along with it, because if the courts don't uphold it, or if the courts misbehave, then it will probably expedite the demise of the Republican Party. Although the previous speakers have been right, there will be hell to pay. There will be disruptions, there will be arson, etc. But I think Biden is going to get enough, and when he does, or if he does, it will be in part because of the new generation. I think there's something to that. The new voters, not necessarily young people, but just people who have sat it out always before. And then jumping backward to the discussion that Dog and Lance had of the progressive era 100 years ago, it'll be due to something about the electorate then. Who is putting Biden ahead now? Women. In 1920, the amendment passes and women can vote, okay? They can actually vote in a few states before that. Women, I think this will please about half of our audience, women might save us from Trump, from his cult, etc., if there are enough votes there of people who believe in norms, who believe in trust, and who are optimists. Then we might be saved from guys like me with Y chromosomes.
Okay. Thank you very much. A name, finally, I got a name, I'm glad. Thank you, Bill. You even had a prediction for the outcome in the Electoral College earlier, didn't you? You had some specific numbers there even.
325.
325? Okay, you heard it first, friends. 325 for Biden. Lance is not agreeing with that, maybe. But that's where you heard it first, here at the SINAS election discussion. Now we have a few minutes left and we have many questions. I'm going to read a few here. I'm going to take one which concerns information and disinformation that we've talked a lot about here, the politics of dissolution and so forth. From Sophia Karlsson, we hear a lot about the right-wing media spreading misinformation and disinformation and how there's a threat to democracy. And of course, that's true. But what is your view on social media companies and the lack of measures they take to control the spread of misinformation and disinformation on their platforms? I think especially about Facebook and the choices they make surrounding fact-checking, not only regular posts, but also political ads. So what do you think of the social media? We talked about that, but the company specifically here, what do you think about their policies here? Any thoughts about that?
Well, I can start by saying that the spread of disinformation is good business. And the result, and particularly when it comes to Facebook, I mean, they've gone all in on politics. They now run campaign operations from inside of Facebook, which are very effective, and they've taken communication out of the public realm and put it into very private, secured networks. So we don't know a lot of what's being discussed in the country. Every once in a while, someone reports what's going on in these places, which is quite scary, and Facebook does something to take them down, but there's currently no regulation, basically. The companies are pressured, and they all have been responding to pressures from one party or the other. And where we are today, the Republicans are claiming that all of these companies, especially the ones that are involved in search and social networks, Google and Twitter and Facebook in particular, that they're all biased against the Republicans and their disinformation. So the fundamental political question is, should we allow disinformation as a political standard for one of the parties, even when it's dangerous?
Mm-hmm. Anyone else want to comment on the companies?
I do. I first want to say I don't know what I would do if I were Mark Zuckerberg or any of those people. I don't know that there is a way out of it, but I do want to note how important the social media are to undoing the way propaganda had previously worked. You may know that Goebbels was fanatical about getting facts right. Okay, he was busy lying about all sorts of people. He was busy repeating lies, but anything that could be fact checked, he wanted fact checked. And if it wasn't both accurate and precise, heads would roll. Unfortunately, since we're talking about Nazis, that could be quite literal. But Goebbels wanted to get it right in order to ground a top-down propaganda outfit. A problem with social media is that it's not top-down, it's bottom-up. And the bottom there, as we've seen with many of these folks on social media, there is no bottom. There is no floor. There is nothing that they won't believe, including most of you have heard at least something of QAnon. That's the sort of thing that at least in our youth, if somebody spouted that, you'd send them home in a taxi because they're too drunk to drive, and you'd urge them to get psychological counseling. And now we've apparently got plenty of Americans who at least pretend to.
Karin, any comments here?
No, just that it's going to be a big battle, right, about these companies. It's already started, so that's for the next administration, I guess, to somehow handle the whole monopoly thing and whether they should be broken up and big topic.
And Biden has some proposals, doesn't he, for regulating at least some of the tech companies, right? Or Warren did. It was Elizabeth Warren who had more of the proposal, Frida, anything from you here on social media and the tech companies?
Nothing to add. I think we might have the next few minutes for another question.
Okay, we have one more question. We have 3 minutes here. One more question that it deals with voter suppression and these questions that we have had. The question is, if the Democrats now win and take back the White House and Congress maybe, will they work to ensure the right to vote by, for example, making voting day a national holiday or establishing automatic voter registration? Those are two things that would make it easier to vote. Do you see any of that, changing the voting day to a holiday or having automatic registration?
My response would be that they will try. I think that the Democrats will try, and they will try because the freer ordinary people are to vote, the better the Democrats believe, and I agree with them, they're going to do, okay? But it does seem to me that it will be difficult, and therefore, if you want reforms, they're more likely to come if the alleged blue wave of Democrats truly does sweep across the country. They're going to happen in state legislatures. So don't write it off. If you're reading about what happens in various states, don't imagine, oh, well, that's a little too peculiar and particular for me to care about. Don't do that. If Texas, for example, goes for Trump, but 9 Republican seats go to the Democrats in the state legislature, then the Democrats, based on the 2020 admittedly truncated census, the Democrats will draw the line. And they may decide simply to draw the lines as fairly and scientifically as they can. They may decide that payback is due and that they're going to gerrymander back again. But as I started with, the Democrats probably know and probably believe that they don't have to, that if the game is played square up, then the Democrats will do just fine. And so they may be able to draw lines that are a hell of a lot fairer than the ones now.
Okay. Anyone else want to comment on that? Corin?
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that they're with Bill here. I think that they have, historically, they've done their share of gerrymandering also. But when it comes to the question whether they will work for to get a election day as a holiday, I would not be surprised. I mean, I've heard Elizabeth Warren say that we're the party that wants everybody to vote. So they have to own up to that. But then if you live in District of Columbia, then you think it's very odd to hear, you know, the Republican propaganda saying, well, we cannot have them making a District of Columbia into a state. And then you really can say, well, if they had dominated the population here in District of Columbia, I'm sure they would want it to become a state, right?
Frida and or Lance, do you want to chime in here? Are we going to have automatic voter registration like we have in Sweden?
No.
No. Okay. Frida?
No.
No. Okay. Here we go with the short answers. And okay. And now my computer says 20:01, meaning that's 1 minute after 8 o'clock in the evening here, and 1 minute after the hour wherever you are, in whatever time zone you happen to be in. So it's unfortunately time to end, and we didn't get to the 14 other questions, but we will come back to these issues, no doubt. We may have an opportunity to welcome some of you back soon to discuss what's going on in America. And I guess my conclusion here is that there are major problems on the horizon in the United States, but there are also some opportunities or possibilities, some realism, perhaps to talk to Lance, for some reform. And the idea of making this comparison to the turn of the beginning of the 20th century with the reform movements that existed then, with the progressive movement changing in many ways the American political landscape is an intriguing one. And I was struck when we talked about the social media companies and this notion of trying to control them or regulate them. That is, of course, exactly what happened to the giant companies in the beginning of the 20th century, the robber barons, and the regulation and the trust busting that went on there in that sense. And perhaps that is something that is coming with the Biden administration. On that note, I would like to thank all of our panelists very much. Thank you so much for participating. Thank you, Uppsala Forum, Patricia, for wonderful cooperation. And thank you to Utrikespolitiska Föreningen, the student organization. And thank you to all of you who have participated here. It's been an enlightening discussion, and I'm very happy to see that 162 people are still logged on. I think that's amazing. Yes, we can give ourselves a round of applause. And tomorrow will be a very exciting day. We will all be following it from our various time zones. And if your predictions are right, we will not know the result of the election for quite some time. So on that happy note, thank you all. Good night or good morning where you are. And may I ask the panelists to stay online, and Patricia, as the rest of you log off.
All right.